Do you want to have dinner with us? The CEO said to a little girl freezing in the train station. When she saw his face, she whispered, "Daddy." The CEO froze. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The November wind cut through Union Station like a blade, and Richard Blackwell pulled his custom wool coat tighter as he strode across the marble floors. At 45, he owned 3 railway companies, 2 luxury hotels, and commanded respect in every boardroom from Chicago to New York. Tonight, he was inspecting his newest acquisition, the historic terminal he'd purchased just 6 months ago. "Sir, the quarterly reports are ready for your review," his assistant Marcus called out, struggling to keep pace with Richard's determined stride. But Richard had stopped dead in his tracks. There, near the old wooden benches by track 7, sat a small figure hunched against the cold stone wall. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair that caught the station's amber lighting. Her thin jacket was nowhere near enough for Chicago's brutal November, and she was shivering so violently that Richard could see it from 20 feet away. "Dear God," he whispered, his executive composure cracking. He approached slowly, the way you might approach a frightened animal. The closer he got, the more his heart ached. She was painfully thin, her cheeks hollow with hunger, her lips blue from the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely, bright green eyes that seemed far too old for such a young face. "Hey there, sweetheart," Richard said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The little girl looked up at him with those haunting green eyes, and Richard felt something stir deep in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite place. "I'm hungry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the station's echoing announcements. Richard's throat tightened. "When's the last time you ate?" Richard's world stopped spinning the moment those Portuguese words left Sophie's lips. His hands trembled as he held her small face, staring into those familiar green eyes that were unmistakably his own. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice breaking. How do you know that language?" She tilted her head with that same gesture he'd seen in the mirror countless times. "Mama used to sing to me in the beautiful language. She said it was the language of my other family, far away. She taught me to say papai because—" her voice grew smaller. "Because she said when I found you, you'd understand." Richard's mind raced back 8 years. Elena had never spoken Portuguese around him, but he'd learned it fluently during his 2 years building railways in Brazil. He'd spoken it constantly during those late nights when they'd worked together on his expansion plans. But Elena had moved away before he'd ever mentioned his time in Sao Paulo. "Mr. Blackwell?" Marcus appeared at their table, concern creasing his features. "Sir, you look pale." "Should I cancel everything?" Richard said firmly, never taking his eyes off Sophie. "Cancel the board meeting, the dinner with the investors, everything." "And Marcus?" "Call Dr. Patricia Chin. Tell her I need an emergency DNA test. Tonight." Sophie looked up at him with trust that nearly broke his heart. "Are you really my daddy?" Richard pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. Somehow, impossibly, it smelled like the baby powder Elena used to love. "I think so, sweetheart. I really think so." 2 hours later, they sat in Dr. Chen's private lab, Sophie asleep in Richard's arms while they waited for the expedited results. The silence was deafening until Dr. Chen emerged, her expression unreadable. "Richard," she said quietly, "you need to prepare yourself. Just tell me. She's yours. 99.97% certainty. She's your daughter." The words hit him like a freight train. 7 years? 7 years of his daughter living in poverty while he built his empire, completely unaware she existed. 7 years of bedtime stories he never told, scraped knees he never kissed, birthdays he never celebrated. "There's something else," Dr. Chin continued, consulting her tablet. "Based on her blood work, she's severely malnourished and shows signs of chronic stress. Richard, this child has been through hell." Sophie stirred in his arms, those green eyes fluttering open. "Daddy? Is it true? Are you really my daddy?" Richard's throat closed completely. The word daddy from her lips was both the most beautiful and most heartbreaking sound he'd ever heard. Yes, baby girl, he managed. I'm your daddy, and I'm never letting you go again. The next morning, Richard's penthouse apartment looked like a tornado had hit it. In 12 hours, he'd had his staff transform the guest room into a princess paradise. Pink walls, a canopy bed, toys scattered everywhere. Sophie sat in the middle of it all, overwhelmed but smiling for the first time since he'd found her. Daddy, is this really all mine? She asked, clutching a stuffed elephant to her chest. Every bit of it, sweetheart. Richard knelt beside her, still learning how to navigate this new reality. Sophie, I need to ask you about Mama. Can you tell me what happened to her? Sophie's smile faded, and she buried her face in the elephant's soft gray fur. She got very sick. The doctors said it was in her blood, and medicine couldn't fix it. She tried to work at the diner even when she was tired, but… Richard's heart clenched. Elena had been a fighter, working 2 jobs to put herself through business school when they'd been together. The idea of her struggling alone, raising his daughter while battling illness, made him sick with guilt. She talked about you all the time, Sophie continued softly. She said you were the bravest man she ever knew, and that you built bridges and railways that connected the whole world. She said she never told you about me because she didn't want to hold you back from your dreams. The words were like daggers. Elena had sacrificed everything, her own dreams, their daughter's future, even her chance at happiness, because she'd thought she'd be a burden. How wrong she'd been. How devastatingly, heartbreakingly wrong. Daddy? Why are you crying? Richard wiped his eyes, not realizing tears had fallen. Because I'm sad I missed so much time with you and Mama. But I'm also happy, because now we're together. Sophie climbed into his lap, a gesture that was becoming natural for both of them. Mama said you'd say that. She said you had the biggest heart in the world, but sometimes you forgot to show it. Elena had known him better than he'd known himself. That afternoon, Richard found himself in Elena's old neighborhood in Phoenix, standing outside a modest apartment complex with Sophie's small hand in his. The property manager, Mrs. Santiago, had tears in her eyes as she handed him Elena's personal effects. Elena was a good woman, Mr. Blackwell. She worked herself to the bone for that little girl. Near the end, when she couldn't work anymore, Mrs. Santiago shook her head. She spent her last money on a bus ticket to Chicago. Said Sophie's father would take care of her. Richard's chest tightened. Did she ever mention me specifically? Every day. She kept a picture of you two from years ago. Sophie would kiss it goodnight. Mrs. Santiago glanced at Sophie, who was exploring the empty apartment. She never stopped loving you, you know. But she was proud. Too proud to ask for help. In Elena's bedroom, Richard found it, a shoebox filled with memories. Photos of them together from 8 years ago, newspaper clippings about his business successes, and dozens of letters addressed to him that had never been sent. With shaking hands, he opened the most recent one, dated just 3 weeks before Elena's death. My dearest Richard, Sophie asks about you every day. She has your eyes, your stubborn streak, and your brilliant mind. I know I should have told you about her years ago, but I was scared you'd think I was trying to trap you. You had such big dreams, and I couldn't bear to be the reason you gave them up. But I'm running out of time, and I can't leave her alone in this world. If something happens to me, please know that she is the best part of both of us. Love her the way I know you can. She's been waiting her whole life to meet her daddy. Always yours, Elena. Sophie appeared beside him, looking up at the letter in his hands. That's Mama's writing. She wrote to you a lot, but she never sent them. She said the right time would come. Richard pulled her close, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. The right time was 7 years ago, baby girl. But we're together now, and that's what matters. But as they drove back to Chicago that evening, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's story had more secrets yet to be revealed. 3 weeks into their new life together, Richard was learning that being a father meant constant surprises. Sophie was brilliant, reading at a level far beyond her 7 years, solving math problems that impressed his own accountants, and displaying an uncanny understanding of human nature that often left him speechless. But she also had nightmares. "Daddy, the mean man is back," she whispered, climbing into his bed at 2 a.m. for the fourth time that week. Richard gathered her close, feeling her small body trembling. "What mean man, sweetheart? In your dream?" "He's not in my dreams," Sophie said quietly. "He was real. He used to come to our apartment when Mama was at work. He said bad things to Mama, made her cry. She tried to hide it from me, but I heard them fighting." Ice shot through Richard's veins. "What kind of bad things?" Sophie was quiet for so long that Richard thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "He said Mama owed him money. He said if she didn't pay, he'd take me away and Mama would never see me again. That's when Mama decided we had to leave." Richard sat up straighter, his protective instincts blazing to life. "Sophie, do you remember this man's name?" "Victor something. He had scary tattoos and he smelled like cigarettes. Mama called him a bad word in Spanish." Sophie looked up at him with those wise, tired eyes. "Daddy, he can't find us here, can he?" "No, baby girl. I promise you, no one will ever hurt you again." But even as he made the promise, Richard's mind was racing. Elena had been running from someone when she'd sent Sophie to Chicago. Someone dangerous enough that she'd risked her daughter's life on the streets rather than stay and face him. The next morning, Richard made 2 phone calls. The first was to his head of security, James Morrison, a former FBI agent who'd worked for Richard's company for 5 years. "James, I need a background check on a man named Victor, possibly connected to Elena Rodriguez in Phoenix. Start with loan sharks, debt collectors, anyone with a criminal record." "Consider it done, sir. Should I assume this is connected to your daughter?" Richard looked through his office window at Sophie, who was helping his assistant organize files with the serious concentration of a tiny executive. "Yes." "And James? This is priority 1. I need to know if we're in any danger." The second call was harder. Richard dialed his brother Michael in Seattle, knowing he had to tell his family about Sophie before the media got wind of it. "You found out you have a daughter, how?" Michael's voice was incredulous. "She was homeless at Union Station. Mike, she's been living in poverty for 7 years while I had no idea she existed." "Jesus, Rich. Are you sure she's yours?" "DNA confirmed it. She looks exactly like me, but she has Elena's spirit." Richard's voice softened. "Mike, she's incredible. Smart as a whip, braver than anyone I know, and she's been through hell. I need to give her the life she deserves." "What about Catherine? Have you told her?" Richard winced. His ex-fiancée Catherine Walsh had left him 6 months ago, claiming he was emotionally unavailable and incapable of putting family before business. The irony wasn't lost on him that she'd been right, and now he had a family he'd never known existed. "Catherine and I are done, Mike. This changes everything." That afternoon, James Morrison walked into Richard's office with a file that made Richard's blood run cold. "Victor Reyes," James said grimly. 42 years old, multiple arrests for loan sharking, extortion, and assault. He runs an illegal gambling operation in Phoenix, and according to my sources, Elena Rodriguez owed him $12,000. $12,000? Richard's voice was sharp. "For what?" "Medical bills. Apparently, Elena borrowed the money for cancer treatments when her insurance was cancelled. Reyes charged her 30% interest, compounded monthly. By the time she died, the debt had ballooned to over $40,000. Richard's hands clenched into fists. "And now? Now he's looking for Sophie. Word on the street is that he considers her collateral for the debt. Under his twisted logic, she belongs to him until the money is paid." The room seemed to tilt. "Are you telling me that this monster thinks he owns my daughter?" "I'm telling you that Victor Reyes is extremely dangerous, and according to my contacts in Phoenix, he's been asking questions about where Elena's daughter disappeared to." Richard stood up slowly, every muscle in his body coiled with protective fury. "Then we'd better make sure he never finds her." But even as he said it, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know where the girl is. We need to talk. VR. Richard stared at his phone, the threatening text burning into his retinas. Across the room, Sophie was curled up on his office couch, reading a book that was probably meant for high schoolers, completely oblivious to the danger circling their new life. James, Richard said quietly, showing him the phone. How the hell did he get this number? James Morrison studied the message, his expression grim. Victor Reyes has connections. Street-level intelligence networks that rival some government agencies. If he knows you have Sophie, he's been watching for a while. Richard's blood turned to ice. Watching her? Here? Possibly. Sir, I need to ask, have you noticed anything unusual? Strange cars in the neighborhood? People who don't belong? Richard's mind raced back over the past 3 weeks. Wait. There was a maintenance worker at the building last Tuesday. Said he was checking the security cameras, but Sophie got scared when she saw him through the window. She said he reminded her of someone, but she couldn't remember who. That's him. He's been surveilling your building. James was already pulling out his phone. I'm calling in a full security detail. Professional bodyguards, surveillance countermeasures, the works. But Richard's phone buzzed again. Another text. No police. No security. Just you, me, and we settle this like businessmen. You have 24 hours to decide. The girl's safety depends on your cooperation. Sophie looked up from her book, sensing the tension in the room. Daddy? You look scared. Is everything okay? Richard forced a smile, walking over to kneel beside her. Everything's fine, Princess. Daddy just has some business to take care of. But Sophie's green eyes, so much like his own, saw right through him. It's about the mean man, isn't it? From Phoenix. Richard's heart stopped. What makes you say that? Because you have the same look Mama used to get when she talked about him. Like you're trying to be brave but you're really scared. Sophie put her small hand on his cheek. It's okay to be scared, Daddy. Mama said being scared just means you love someone enough to worry about them. Elena's wisdom, spoken through their daughter's innocent voice, nearly broke him. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Richard made a decision that went against every instinct James Morrison had. He drove alone to a diner on the outskirts of Chicago, the location Victor Reyes had texted him. It was the kind of place that existed in the shadows, dirty windows, flickering neon signs, and clientele that didn't ask questions. Victor Reyes was exactly what Richard had expected, and somehow worse. Mid-40s, built like a boxer gone to seed, with tattoos crawling up his neck and dead eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, no humanity. He sat in a corner booth, drinking black coffee and exuding menace like cologne. The famous Richard Blackwell, Victor said as Richard slid into the opposite seat. You're smaller than I expected. And you're exactly as pathetic as I imagined. Richard kept his voice level, but every muscle in his body was coiled for action. What do you want? Victor smiled, revealing gold teeth. Straight to business. I like that. Elena Rodriguez died owing me $43,412. Her daughter is collateral for that debt. Her daughter is my daughter, and she's not collateral for anything. See, that's where you're wrong, Mr. Billionaire. In my world, debts don't die with the debtor. They transfer. Elena made a deal. If anything happened to her, the girl would work off the debt. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you anywhere near Sophie. Victor tasted the name like wine. Pretty name for a pretty little girl. Smart too, from what I hear. Elena used to brag about how clever she was. Said the kid could read and write better than most adults. The casual way Victor discussed his daughter made Richard's vision turn red. Name your price. Smart man. I like you already. Victor pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. 50,000. Cash. Tonight. 50,000 for a debt that was supposedly 43? Interest. And inconvenience fees. Tracking down deadbeats is expensive work. Richard studied Victor's face, seeing the calculation behind those dead eyes. This wasn't about money, this was about power, control, the sick satisfaction of owning something precious and innocent. "I'll pay the 50,000, Richard said quietly. "But I want something in return." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You're not exactly in a position to negotiate. I want Elena's original contract. The paperwork that proves she owed you money. And I want your word that you'll never contact my daughter or anyone in my family again." "My word?" Victor laughed. "You want a handshake deal with a loan shark?" "I want insurance." Richard pulled out his own phone, showing Victor a photo. "See, while you were tracking down my daughter, I was tracking down your operation. Your gambling dens, your money laundering, your tax evasion. I have enough evidence to put you away for 20 years. Victor's smile faded. "You threatening me? I'm offering you a deal. 50,000 cash, you disappear forever, and we both walk away clean. Or I make one phone call to the FBI, and you spend the rest of your life in federal prison." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the scarred table. Finally, Victor nodded. "You got balls, Blackwell. I respect that." He pulled out a manila envelope. "Elena's contract, and my personal guarantee that you'll never see me again." But as Victor stood to leave, he leaned down close to Richard's ear. "Just remember, rich boy, there are other people like me out there. And word travels fast about a billionaire with a soft spot. You better keep that little girl close." Richard drove home through the empty Chicago streets, the envelope containing Elena's dead burning like acid in his passenger seat. He bought Sophie's safety, but at what cost? And why did he have the terrible feeling that Victor Reyes's threats were just the beginning? The envelope sat unopened on Richard's desk for 3 days. Every time he looked at it, he felt the weight of Elena's desperation, the choices she'd been forced to make, and the secret that had cost her everything. Sophie, meanwhile, had begun to bloom in their luxury penthouse like a flower finally given sunlight. She'd started calling him Daddy, naturally, had made friends with the doorman's daughter, and was already reading at a high school level. But Richard could see the shadows in her eyes, the way she tensed when strangers approached, how she hoarded food at meals as if afraid it might disappear, the nightmares that still woke her crying for her mama. "Daddy?" Sophie found him in his study on Friday evening, clutching her stuffed elephant. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything, princess." "Why didn't you and Mama get married?" The question hit him like a physical blow. How do you explain adult complications to a 7-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that you were too focused on building an empire to see the love right in front of you? "Come here, sweetheart." Richard pulled her onto his lap, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Mama and I loved each other very much, but we both thought we wanted different things. I thought I had to choose between love and my dreams, and I chose wrong." Sophie considered this with the serious expression she got when working through complex problems. "Mama said you were building something important. She said you were going to help millions of people travel safely. She was right. But none of it mattered without the people I love." Richard hugged her closer. "Sophie, I need you to know something. If I had known about you, I would have moved heaven and earth to be with you and Mama. Every single day." "I know, Daddy. Mama knew too. That's why she never told you." The simple wisdom of children never ceased to amaze him. Sophie understood, at 7 years old, the sacrifice Elena had made. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Richard finally opened Elena's contract with Victor Reyes. What he found inside made his hands shake with rage. The original debt had been for $8,000, not 12. Elena had borrowed the money for experimental cancer treatments not covered by insurance, treatments that might have saved her life. But Victor's contract was a masterpiece of predatory lending. Hidden fees, compound interest, and clauses that allowed him to change terms at will. More disturbing was a handwritten note clipped to the contract. "If debtor dies, custody of minor child transfers to creditor for labor purposes until debt satisfied." Richard's vision blurred with fury. Victor hadn't just been Elena's creditor. He planned to enslave Sophie. But there was something else in the envelope. A letter in Elena's handwriting, dated just days before her death. Richard, if you're reading this, then Sophie found you and Victor found her. I know you'll pay whatever he asks, because that's who you are. You fix things, you protect people, you move mountains for the ones you love. But there's something you need to know about why I really left Chicago 8 years ago. Something I should have told you then, but I was young and scared and stupid. I wasn't just pregnant when I left. Someone was threatening me, threatening us, because of something you were working on. The Brazil Railway project. Someone didn't want it to succeed. They said if I stayed with you, if I distracted you from making the right choice, something terrible would happen. I was so scared, Richard. So I ran, and I took our secret with me. I thought I was protecting you both. But I think I may have been wrong about who the real threat was. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone who claims to be your friend has your best interests at heart. Protect our daughter. She's the best of both of us, and she's going to change the world someday. All my love, Elena. Richard read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. Someone had threatened Elena 8 years ago to get her away from him. The Brazil project had been worth billions, and there had been competitors who'd wanted the contract. But who? And were they still a threat? His private line rang, startling him from his thoughts. Richard? The voice was familiar, warm, concerned. It's Catherine. I heard about Sophie through the news. I had to call. His ex-fiancée's voice brought back memories of their relationship, the fights about his work priorities, her constant accusations that he couldn't commit to anything but his business. Catherine. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Are you kidding? Richard, you have a daughter. This changes everything. There was something in her tone, excitement, calculation. I know we had our problems, but maybe this is a sign. Maybe we could try again, be a family. Sophie needs a mother figure, and we were so good together when you weren't buried in work. Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago weather. Catherine, I appreciate the call, but I'm already in the lobby. Can I come up? Just to meet her, to see if there's still something between us? The line went dead, and Richard stared at his phone in disbelief. Catherine was here, now, without invitation, acting as if Sophie's existence somehow changed their relationship. But as he walked to the elevator to meet her, Elena's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone who claims to be your friend has your best interests at heart. And Richard couldn't shake the terrible feeling that Catherine's sudden reappearance in his life, just days after he'd discovered he had a daughter, was no coincidence at all. Chapter 7. The perfect storm. Catherine Walsh hadn't changed in the 6 months since their breakup. Still stunning at 38, with platinum blonde hair and ice blue eyes that could charm investors or cut through steel, depending on her mood. But tonight, as she stood in Richard's penthouse living room, something felt different about her. Something that made his skin crawl. Where is she? Catherine asked, her gaze sweeping the luxury apartment with calculating precision. Where's your daughter? She's asleep, Richard said carefully, positioning himself between Catherine and the hallway that led to Sophie's room. Catherine, what are you really doing here? I told you. I heard about Sophie on the news, and I realized how wrong I was about us. She moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch his chest. Richard, we could be perfect together. You, me, and Sophie. She needs a mother, and we were always meant to be a family. Richard stepped back, his instincts screaming warnings. 6 months ago, you said I was emotionally unavailable and incapable of putting family first. Now suddenly you want to play house? Catherine's perfect smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Richard almost missed it. But in that instant, he saw something cold and predatory in her eyes. People change, Richard. Priorities shift. Finding out you have a daughter. It changes everything, doesn't it? Daddy? Sophie's small voice came from the hallway. She stood there in her pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes, but Richard noticed how she stayed partially hidden behind the wall. I heard voices. Catherine's entire demeanor shifted, becoming warm and maternal in a way that felt rehearsed. Oh my goodness, she's beautiful! Sophie, right? I'm Catherine. I'm a friend of your daddy's. Sophie studied Catherine with those wise green eyes, then looked at Richard. Even at 7 years old, she could read the tension in the room. It's late, Princess, Richard said gently. Why don't you go back to bed? We can talk more in the morning. But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head in that familiar gesture. You smell like the lady who used to watch me sometimes. Richard's blood turned to ice. What lady, sweetheart? When Mama was really sick and had to go to the hospital, there was a blonde lady who would come to our apartment. She said she was from the church, but she asked lots of questions about Daddy. About his work and his trains. Catherine's face went completely blank. I think she's confused. Children often mix up memories when they're traumatized. But Richard was already moving, scooping Sophie into his arms. Sophie, look at me carefully. Is this the same lady? Sophie studied Catherine's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She looks different now. Her hair is prettier, and her clothes are fancy. But it's the same eyes. The room exploded into tense silence. Catherine's mask had completely slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Well, Catherine said softly, her voice losing all warmth. This is unfortunate. Richard's arms tightened around Sophie protectively. Who are you working for, Catherine? Who sent you to Phoenix? Oh, Richard. You always were too smart for your own good. Catherine reached into her purse, and Richard tensed, ready to run. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a small recording device. Did you really think Elena's disappearance 8 years ago was coincidence? Did you think finding Sophie now was random chance? What are you talking about? Catherine's laugh was bitter. The Brazil Railway contract, Richard. Worth $3 billion. Your company wasn't the only one bidding for it. Marcus Industries wanted it badly, badly enough to make sure you were distracted. During the final negotiations, the name hit Richard like a freight train. Marcus Industries, his biggest competitor, run by Jonathan Marcus, a man who'd been trying to destroy Richard's business for over a decade. You worked for Marcus the entire time we were together, Richard said, the pieces falling into place. Our entire relationship was a lie. Not entirely. I did care about you, Richard. But business is business. Catherine's voice turned venomous. Elena was supposed to be a simple problem. We threatened her, she left Chicago, you got distracted and depressed, we got the Brazil contract. Clean and simple. Sophie was trembling in Richard's arms, and he could feel his daughter's fear like a physical thing. But Elena didn't just disappear. Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. She was pregnant. We didn't know that until 2 years later. By then, she'd vanished completely. Catherine shrugged as if discussing the weather. When Elena got sick, we thought the problem would solve itself. But then she sent the girl to find you, and suddenly our carefully constructed plan was falling apart. So you had me followed. You've been watching Sophie. We had to know if she was really yours. If she posed a threat to our long-term strategy. Catherine's eyes glittered dangerously. But then something wonderful happened. You fell in love with being a father. You got soft, sentimental. And now, instead of the ruthless businessman who built an empire, you're just another single dad who'll do anything to protect his little girl. Richard felt pure rage building in his chest. What do you want? The Blackwell Transportation Network. All of it. You're going to sign over controlling interest to Marcus Industries, or Sophie is going to disappear just like her mother did. Daddy, Sophie whispered, her small hand clutching his shirt. I'm scared. Richard looked down at his daughter, this brilliant, brave little girl who'd survived homelessness, abuse, and the loss of her mother, and felt something crystallize inside him. Catherine was right about one thing, he had changed. But she was wrong about what that meant. You know what, Catherine? Richard said, his voice calm and deadly. You're absolutely right. I'm not the same man I was before I found Sophie. I'm more dangerous now, because I have something worth fighting for. In one fluid motion, Richard activated the panic button on his watch, a security feature James Morrison had insisted on. Then he smiled at Catherine with predatory satisfaction. But there's one thing you didn't plan for in your perfect little conspiracy. What's that? I've been recording this entire conversation. Richard held up his phone, showing the active voice memo app. And James Morrison has been listening from the security office downstairs. You just confessed to conspiracy, extortion, and threatening a child. Catherine's face went white as the sound of sirens began wailing in the distance. This isn't over, Richard, she snarled, backing toward the door. Marcus Industries doesn't give up. Sophie will never be safe as long as she's a threat to our business. Then I guess you better hope you never see us again, Richard said quietly. Because next time, I won't be calling the police first. The FBI task force that descended on Richard's penthouse looked like something out of a movie. Agent Sarah Connor, yes, that was really her name, and yes, she'd heard all the jokes, had been tracking Marcus Industries' illegal activities for 3 years. Catherine's recorded confession was exactly the break she needed. Mr. Blackwell, Agent Connor said, reviewing the transcript of Catherine's recording, this is bigger than just your family. Marcus Industries has been using intimidation, extortion, and worse to secure government contracts for over a decade. Your case gives us the evidence we need to bring down the entire organization. Sophie sat curled up in Richard's lap, still shaken by the night's events. Agent Connor, she said in her small, serious voice, are you going to arrest the bad people who hurt my mama? Agent Connor knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her expression gentle. We're going to try our very best, sweetheart. But we need your daddy's help, and we need both of you to be very careful until we can round up everyone involved. What does that mean? Richard asked. It means Marcus Industries knows their secret is out. They're going to be desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. Agent Connor stood, her expression grim. We can offer you witness protection, but given your public profile, it would be difficult to disappear completely. Richard looked down at Sophie, seeing the trust in her green eyes, trust that he would protect her, no matter what. What other options do we have? We fight back, James Morrison said from the doorway. We use your resources, my security expertise, and the FBI's evidence to take these bastards down once and for all. Agent Connor nodded. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. Marcus Industries operates in the shadows. If we drag them into the light, show the world what they've done, they lose their power. Richard finished. But Sophie will be surrounded by the best security money can buy. James interrupted. Sir, I've already assembled a team. Former Secret Service, Navy SEALs, the works. Sophie won't be out of our sight for a second. Sophie looked up at Richard with those wise eyes. Daddy, what would Mama want us to do? The question stopped Richard cold. Elena had spent her life running from these people, hiding, trying to protect their daughter through sacrifice and secrecy. But in the end, it had cost her everything. Mama would want us to fight, Richard said firmly. She would want us to make sure no other family goes through what we went through. Over the next 48 hours, Richard's penthouse became a war room. FBI agents worked alongside private security, analyzing phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage. The scope of Marcus Industries' crimes was staggering. Dozens of families threatened or destroyed, billions in fraudulent contracts, and a web of corruption that reached into government agencies. But Jonathan Marcus himself remained elusive. He's smart, Agent Connor admitted during a strategy meeting. We've frozen his assets, arrested his key lieutenants, but Marcus himself has vanished. Our intelligence suggests he's gone international. What about Catherine? Richard asked. Still in the wind. She slipped out of the country before we could arrest her. Agent Connor consulted her tablet. But we did find something interesting in her hotel room. Photos of Sophie, taken over the past 3 weeks. Someone's been watching your daughter very closely. Richard felt his blood pressure spike. Watching her where? How did they get close enough? That's what concerns us. James Morrison interrupted. These photos were taken from impossible angles. Inside the building, inside your apartment, inside Sophie's school. Mr. Blackwell, they had inside help. The room went silent as the implications sank in. Someone Richard trusted, someone with access to their most private moments, had been feeding information to Marcus Industries. Daddy? Sophie appeared in the doorway, holding her stuffed elephant. Can I talk to you? Richard excused himself from the meeting, following Sophie to her room. She climbed onto her bed, patting the space beside her for him to sit. I know everyone's trying to protect me, she said carefully, but I think I might know something that could help. What is it, Princess? The day we went to see Mama's old apartment in Phoenix, remember? You got a phone call, and I played in the lobby while you talked to that man with the big voice. Richard remembered. He'd had to take an urgent call from one of his board members about a merger negotiation. There was a lady in the lobby. Sophie continued. She was pretending to read a magazine, but she kept taking pictures of me with her phone. When I looked at her, she smiled and said she was a photographer for a children's clothing company. Richard's heart stopped. Sophie, why didn't you tell me this before? Because she seemed nice, and you were busy. But Daddy. She had the same ring that the blonde lady wore. The one who used to watch me in Phoenix. The same ring? Sophie nodded gravely. A big blue stone with little diamonds around it. Mama said it was called a sapphire, and that only very rich ladies could afford rings like that. Richard's mind raced. A sapphire ring with diamonds, that was a very specific, very expensive piece of jewelry. If Catherine and this mystery photographer wore matching rings. Sophie, you might have just solved this entire case, he said, hugging her tightly. But as they sat together in her room, surrounded by the trappings of their new life, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. Marcus Industries had been planning this for 8 years, had destroyed Elena's life, and had infiltrated his most trusted circle. The question that kept him awake that night was simple but terrifying. If they had inside help, how many other people in his life were secretly working for his enemies? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called Richard directly on his private line, a number that only his most trusted associates had. Mr. Blackwell, I'm so sorry to bother you at home, but something strange happened at school today, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight with concern. A woman came by claiming to be Sophie's new pediatrician. She said you'd sent her to do a health evaluation for Sophie's school records. Richard's blood turned to ice. What did she look like? Blonde, very professional, about 40 years old. She had all the right paperwork, knew Sophie's full name and birth date. But something felt off about her, so I told her she'd need to come back with you present. Mrs. Henderson, you may have just saved my daughter's life, Richard said, already signaling to James Morrison across the room. That woman was not sent by me, and Sophie doesn't have a new pediatrician. Oh my God! Should I call the police? They're already on their way. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to lock down the school immediately. No one gets in or out until FBI agents arrive. Richard hung up and turned to Agent Connor, who'd been monitoring all of his communications. They're getting desperate. They tried to grab Sophie from school. Which means they're running out of time and options. Agent Connor replied grimly. Marcus must be planning something big, something that requires Sophie to be out of the picture permanently. Sophie, who'd been quietly doing homework at Richard's office conference table, looked up with those perceptive green eyes. They want to take me away again, don't they? Richard knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. Sophie, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Some very bad people are trying to hurt our family, but we're not going to let them. But that means we have to be extra careful for a while. Like when Mama and I had to hide from the mean man in Phoenix. The parallel wasn't lost on Richard. Elena had spent Sophie's entire life running and hiding, and now he was asking his daughter to do the same thing. But this time, things would be different. This time, Sophie wouldn't face the danger alone. Yes, but different, Richard said firmly. This time, we're not running. This time, we're fighting back. That evening, Richard's legal team delivered news that changed everything. Marcus Industries' financial empire was collapsing. The FBI investigation had triggered audits, frozen assets, and sent their stock price into free fall. But instead of making Jonathan Marcus more cautious, it had made him reckless. "Sir," Richard's head lawyer, David Chen, announced during their evening briefing, "Marcus Industries just made a desperate play. They're claiming that Sophie isn't actually your biological daughter, that Elena Rodriguez defrauded you into believing you were the father." Richard stared at the legal documents, fury building in his chest. They're challenging the DNA test? More than that. They're claiming Elena was running a long-term con, that she deliberately got pregnant by another man, and then coached Sophie to approach you at the train station. David shook his head in disgust. It's completely baseless. But if they can create enough doubt, they might be able to claim Sophie is part of some elaborate fraud scheme, which would make her a ward of the state. Agent Connor added, and vulnerable to disappearing. Sophie had been listening from the corner, where she'd been reading a book. Now she walked over to Richard with that serious expression she got when processing complex adult problems. "Daddy, they're saying I'm not really your daughter?" Richard pulled her onto his lap, his heart breaking at the confusion in her voice. "Sophie, you are my daughter in every way that matters. The DNA test proved it, but even without that, I would know. You have my eyes, my stubborn streak, and my ability to see through people's lies." But why would they say that? Because they're desperate, and desperate people tell lies to try to get what they want. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at him with sudden determination. "Daddy, I have an idea. But you might not like it. Tell me. What if we let them think they won? What if we pretend to believe their lies, and then catch them when they try to hurt me?" The adults in the room exchanged glances. Agent Connor leaned forward. "Sophie, that's actually not a bad idea, but it would be very dangerous." "I know. But Mama always said that sometimes you have to be brave to protect the people you love." Sophie's voice was steady, far too mature for a 7-year-old. "And I want to make sure no other little girls have to go through what I went through." Richard felt pride and terror warring in his chest. His daughter was brilliant, brave, and absolutely right. But the idea of using her as bait made every paternal instinct scream in protest. "Sophie, if we did something like that, you'd have to trust me completely. You'd have to do exactly what I say, when I say it, no matter how scared you get." "I trust you, Daddy. You came to find me when I was all alone. You kept me safe from the mean man. And you loved Mama even when she was gone." Sophie's green eyes were fierce with determination. "Let's catch the bad people so they can't hurt anyone else." As Richard held his daughter close, surrounded by FBI agents and security experts planning an operation that would use a 7-year-old as the key to bringing down a criminal empire, he realized that Elena had been wrong about one thing. Sophie wasn't just the best of both of them. She was better than either of them had ever been. The plan was elegantly simple and absolutely terrifying. Richard would appear to crack under the pressure of Marcus Industries' legal challenge, publicly questioning Sophie's paternity and demanding new DNA tests. The media would eat up the story of the billionaire's family fraud, and in the chaos, Marcus would make his move to eliminate the only witness who could destroy him. But first, they needed to flush out the insider who'd been feeding information to their enemies. Richard called an emergency meeting of his inner circle, the 5 people who had unlimited access to his life and schedule. David Chen, his lawyer. Patricia Morrison, his personal assistant. Michael Blackwell, his brother. James Morrison, his head of security. And Dr. Patricia Chen, the physician who'd conducted Sophie's DNA test. "I need to know who I can trust," Richard announced to the group assembled in his private conference room. "Someone in this room has been feeding information to Marcus Industries for years." The silence was deafening. Everyone looked at everyone else with suspicion and shock. "Sir," James Morrison said carefully, "are you certain the leak is coming from someone here?" "Positive. The photos of Sophie, the inside knowledge of our movements, the fact that Catherine knew about Elena's pregnancy before we did, it all points to someone with intimate access to my life." Michael Blackwell, Richard's younger brother, spoke up from the end of the table. Rich, this is insane. We've all known each other for years. We're family. Elena thought she could trust people too. Richard replied coldly. Look how that ended. Dr. Patricia Chin cleared her throat nervously. Richard, I understand you're under tremendous stress, but accusing your closest associates is exactly what I need to do. Richard stood up, walking to the windows that overlooked Chicago's skyline. Sophie and I are going into hiding tomorrow. New identities, new location, everything. But only one person in this room will know where we're going. He turned back to face the group. I'm going to tell each of you a different location. Whichever location Marcus Industries shows up at will tell me who the traitor is. The plan worked faster than Richard had expected. Within 6 hours of the meeting, James Morrison's security team intercepted communications showing that Marcus operatives were heading to 5 different locations, the exact 5 locations Richard had given his inner circle. They're all working together, Agent Connor said in disbelief as she reviewed the intelligence reports. Your brother, your lawyer, your doctor, your assistant, even your head of security. Richard, they'd been planning this for years. Richard felt the foundation of his world crumbling. Everyone he trusted, everyone he'd loved and relied on, had been systematically betraying him for nearly a decade. How? Was all he could manage. Money. Blackmail. Threats. Marcus Industries has had 8 years to build a web around you. Agent Connor consulted her files. Your brother Michael has been in debt from gambling for years. They've been paying his loans. Dr. Chen's medical license was under review for malpractice. They made the investigation disappear. Patricia Morrison's son was arrested for drug dealing. Charges mysteriously dropped. And James Morrison? James Morrison is actually Jonathan Marcus's nephew. He's been feeding information directly to his uncle since the day you hired him. The betrayal was so complete, so overwhelming, that Richard felt physically sick. For 8 years, he'd been surrounded by enemies pretending to be family. Every decision, every plan, every private moment had been reported back to the man who destroyed Elena's life. Daddy? Sophie appeared in the doorway, having slipped past the FBI agents with the stealth that only children possessed. You look sad. Richard gathered her into his arms, wondering how to explain that everyone they thought they could trust had been lying to them. Sophie, remember how Mama told you that sometimes people wear masks to hide who they really are? Like Halloween? Kind of. Some people wear invisible masks, pretending to be good when they're really bad inside. Sophie studied his face with those wise green eyes. The people in your meeting were wearing masks? Yes, Princess. They were. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, then surprised him with a question. Daddy, did you tell them all different places we were going to hide? Richard stared at his daughter, amazed once again by her intelligence. How did you know that? Because that's what Mama did when she thought someone was telling the mean man where we lived. She told 3 different people 3 different stories, and then we watched to see which story he heard. Elena had been smarter than any of them realized. She'd been playing the same game, using the same tactics to protect their daughter. What happened when your mama did that? We found out Mrs. Garcia from the church was the one telling the mean man our secrets. So we moved away and never told Mrs. Garcia where we went. Sophie looked up at him seriously. Are we going to move away from the people with masks? We're going to do something better than that, sweetheart. We're going to make sure they can never hurt anyone again. But as Richard held his daughter close, surrounded by FBI agents planning the final confrontation with Marcus Industries, he realized that Jonathan Marcus had one more card to play, one that Richard had never seen coming. Because if Marcus had been planning this for 8 years, if he'd systematically placed people in Richard's inner circle, if he'd orchestrated Elena's exile and manipulated every aspect of their lives, then Marcus had known about Sophie long before Elena died. Had known she was Richard's daughter, had been tracking her, had been waiting for exactly the right moment to use her, and that meant tomorrow's confrontation wasn't going to be a trap for Marcus. It was going to be a trap for them. The realization hit Richard like a freight train at 3 a.m., jolting him awake from restless sleep. If Marcus Industries had been orchestrating everything for 8 years, Then finding Sophie at Union Station hadn't been luck or fate, it had been staged. Richard slipped out of bed and went to Sophie's room, where she slept peacefully surrounded by FBI protection. Looking at his daughter's innocent face, he tried to process the horrifying possibility that was taking shape in his mind. What if Sophie's appearance at the train station had been planned? What if Marcus had allowed, or even orchestrated, Elena's death, knowing that Sophie would eventually seek out her father? What if the entire emotional journey of the past month had been manipulation on a scale too vast to comprehend? Can't sleep either? Agent Connor materialized in the hallway, her voice low to avoid waking Sophie. Agent Connor, I need you to check something for me, Richard said quietly. Elena Rodriguez's death certificate. Specifically, the timeline of her illness and the hospital where she died. Why? Because if Marcus Industries has been planning this for 8 years, they wouldn't leave Elena's death to chance. 20 minutes later, Agent Connor returned with information that made Richard's worst fears seem conservative. Elena Rodriguez died at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix, she said grimly. The attending physician was Dr. Robert Marcus, Jonathan Marcus's younger brother. The cancer treatment she received in her final months was funded by a charitable foundation that we've now traced to Marcus Industries. Richard's vision blurred with rage. They kept her alive long enough to make sure Sophie would come looking for me. It gets worse. The bus ticket Sophie used to get to Chicago? Purchased with a credit card registered to one of Marcus Industries' shell companies. The timing of her arrival at Union Station coincided exactly with your scheduled inspection tour. Jesus Christ. Richard sank into a chair as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. They've been playing with us like chess pieces. Elena's exile, her death, Sophie's homelessness, our reunion, all of it choreographed. Which means tomorrow's operation is exactly what Marcus wants. He's been maneuvering us toward this confrontation from the beginning. But even as Richard grappled with the magnitude of Marcus's manipulation, one thing remained absolutely clear. Regardless of how their meeting had been orchestrated, Sophie was his daughter, and she was in mortal danger. Agent Connor, we need to change the plan. Everything. If Marcus has been controlling this situation from the start, then he's already 3 steps ahead of us. What do you propose? Richard looked through the doorway at Sophie, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding her life. Elena had sacrificed everything to protect their daughter, only to have her final desperate plan turned into another weapon against them. But Sophie herself had given him the answer weeks ago, when she'd suggested they let Marcus think he was winning and then catch him in the act. We're going to give Marcus exactly what he wants, Richard said finally. But not the way he expects. Agent Connor raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Marcus Industries thinks they've been playing chess with me for 8 years. But they've never met the real player in this game. Who's that? Richard smiled for the first time in days, a cold, determined expression that would have terrified Jonathan Marcus if he could have seen it. Sophie. My daughter has been surviving, adapting, and outsmarting dangerous adults her entire life. Elena trained her well, and she's inherited the best qualities from both of us. Marcus Industries has never faced an opponent like her. Richard, she's 7 years old. She's 7 years old and smarter than everyone in this room combined. She's been listening to our conversations, analyzing our strategies, and I guarantee she's already figured out things that we've missed. As if summoned by their conversation, Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Daddy? I had another idea about the bad people. Richard knelt down to her level, his heart swelling with pride and terror. What is it, Princess? The man who wants to hurt us, Mr. Marcus, he thinks he's very smart because he's been tricking us for a long time, right? Right. But he made a big mistake, Sophie said with the serious confidence of someone much older. He forgot that I know things he doesn't know. What kind of things? Sophie's green eyes gleamed with an intelligence that made Richard's breath catch. I know where he is. The room went completely silent. Agent Connor stepped forward. Sophie, what do you mean? The night the blonde lady came here, before the police came, she made a phone call. She thought I was asleep, But I was listening. Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. She said, "The package is secure, Uncle Jonathan. We'll proceed with the Chicago timeline." And then she said an address. Richard and Agent Connor exchanged shocked glances. "Sophie, do you remember the address?" "Of course. Mama taught me to remember important things." Sophie recited a street address that Agent Connor immediately typed into her phone. That's a warehouse district on the south side," Agent Connor said, her voice filled with amazement. "Sophie, you might have just handed us Jonathan Marcus on a silver platter." But Sophie wasn't finished. "There's one more thing. The blonde lady said something else on the phone. She said, when the father comes for the final meeting, make sure the extraction team is ready. The girl won't be a problem after tonight." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus wasn't just planning to eliminate Sophie as a witness, he was planning to do it during tomorrow's confrontation, when Richard would be forced to watch. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly, slipping her small hand into his, "I think it's time to show the bad people that they're not as smart as they think they are." Richard looked down at his daughter, this remarkable, brave, brilliant little girl who'd survived everything Marcus Industries had thrown at her, and realized that Elena had been right about one thing: Sophie was going to change the world, starting tomorrow. The warehouse on Chicago's south side looked abandoned from the outside, but Richard could see the subtle signs of occupation: fresh tire tracks in the gravel, recently cleaned windows on the upper floors, and the faint glow of interior lighting behind blackout curtains. This was where Jonathan Marcus had been orchestrating his empire of lies. "Remember the plan," Agent Connor said through Richard's earpiece as he approached the building with Sophie's small hand in his. "Get him to confess, get him angry enough to reveal his full operation, and trust that Sophie knows what she's doing." Richard squeezed his daughter's hand gently. "Are you ready, Princess?" Sophie looked up at him with those brilliant green eyes, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look even younger and more vulnerable than her 7 years. But Richard could see the steel beneath the innocent exterior, Elena's fierce determination combined with his own strategic mind. "I'm ready, Daddy. Let's finish this." The warehouse door opened before they could knock. Jonathan Marcus stood there in person for the first time, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and cold gray eyes that held no warmth, no humanity. He was smaller than Richard had expected, but radiated the kind of calculated menace that came from decades of destroying lives without consequence. "Richard Blackwell," Marcus said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "And the famous Sophie Rodriguez. Or should I say Sophie Blackwell? Though I suppose that's still a matter of some debate." "We came like you asked," Richard said evenly. "Now what do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Your complete destruction." Marcus gestured for them to enter the warehouse. "Come in. We have so much to discuss." The interior had been converted into a bizarre combination of office space and control room. Banks of monitors showed surveillance footage from locations across Chicago: Richard's penthouse, Sophie's school, even Elena's grave in Phoenix. The walls were covered with photos, documents, and timeline charts mapping out 8 years of systematic manipulation. "Impressive, isn't it?" Marcus said, noting Richard's shocked expression. 8 years of careful planning, and it all comes down to this moment." Sophie walked closer to the monitors, studying them with the intense concentration she usually reserved for complex math problems. "You've been watching everyone for a very long time," she said in her small, serious voice. "Very observant, little one." "Yes, I've been watching. Waiting. Planning." Marcus walked to a large chart on the wall showing a detailed timeline. "Your father thought he was so clever, building his railway empire. But he never realized that every success, every contract, every decision was being influenced by me." "The Brazil project," Richard said, understanding flooding through him. "Just the beginning. I let you win that contract because I needed you to become successful enough to be worth destroying." Marcus's voice was filled with sick satisfaction. "Elena Rodriguez was supposed to be a brief distraction, a way to keep you unfocused during the crucial negotiation period. But then she disappeared, and I realized she might be more useful as a long-term asset. Sophie had moved to a different monitor, one showing footage of Elena in a hospital bed. "You made my mama sick," she said quietly. "Cancer is a convenient disease," Marcus said with chilling casualness. "Easy to accelerate, difficult to trace. Your mother lasted longer than I expected, but that worked out perfectly. It gave me time to place my people in your father's organization." Richard felt rage building in his chest, but Sophie's calm presence kept him focused. His daughter was studying Marcus like a scientist examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. "Why?" Sophie asked. "Why did you hurt so many people?" Marcus knelt down to her level, and Richard had to fight every instinct not to snatch his daughter away from this monster. "Because I could, my dear. Because power is the only thing that matters in this world, and your father had power that should have been mine." Marcus's mask of civility slipped, revealing something twisted and bitter underneath. "I built my company before Richard Blackwell was even born, but somehow his pretty trains and noble intentions impressed the investment community more than my proven track record. So you decided to destroy him," Sophie said, her voice still eerily calm. "I decided to show the world what Richard Blackwell really was underneath all that success. A man who would abandon his pregnant girlfriend, who would ignore his own child living in poverty, who would sacrifice anything for money and power." Sophie tilted her head in that familiar gesture. "But that's not who my daddy is." "No?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Then why did he spend 7 years building his empire while you lived on the streets?" "Because he didn't know about me," Sophie said simply. "And you made sure he couldn't know." For the first time, Marcus looked uncertain. "I gave Elena every opportunity to contact him. She chose not to." "No," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "You threatened her. You made her scared. You told her that if she told Daddy about me, something bad would happen to all of us." Marcus's face darkened. "You're just a child. You don't understand. I understand that you're a bully." Sophie interrupted, and suddenly she didn't sound like a 7-year-old anymore. She sounded like Elena, fierce, protective, unafraid. "I understand that you hurt my mama because you were jealous of my daddy. And I understand that you thought you were smarter than everyone else. I am smarter than everyone else." Marcus snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I orchestrated this entire scenario. Your reunion with your father, his emotional attachment to you, even this final confrontation, all of it was my design." Sophie smiled then, an expression so knowing, so mature, that it made Richard's breath catch. "You made one mistake, Mr. Marcus," she said quietly. "What mistake?" "You thought I was just a little girl. You thought I couldn't understand grown-up things. But my mama taught me to listen, to remember, and to think." Sophie walked to the control panel Marcus had been using to monitor the surveillance feeds. "And I've been thinking about this for weeks." She pressed a series of buttons on the console, and suddenly every monitor in the room switched to the same image, a live feed of FBI agents surrounding the warehouse. Marcus spun around, his face white with shock. "What did you do?" "I told Agent Connor exactly which buttons to push to override your security system," Sophie said calmly. "I've been watching you use that control panel since we got here. It wasn't very hard to figure out." Richard stared at his daughter in amazement. While he'd been focused on getting Marcus to confess, Sophie had been systematically dismantling the man's technological advantage. "You see, Mr. Marcus," Sophie continued, "you spent 8 years thinking you were playing chess with my daddy. But you were really playing with my mama, and then with me. And Mama taught me that the best way to beat a bully is to let them think they're winning until the very last second." The warehouse doors burst open as FBI agents flooded in, led by Agent Connor with her weapon drawn. "Jonathan Marcus, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, murder, and about 30 other federal charges," Agent Connor announced. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sophie with something like respect in his eyes. "You're your mother's daughter," he said quietly. "I'm my father's daughter too," Sophie replied. "And that's why you never had a chance." Later, As they sat in Richard's penthouse watching the sunrise over Chicago, Sophie curled up in his lap with her stuffed elephant. "Daddy?" she said sleepily. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything, princess." "When I'm older, can I help you build things? Like trains and bridges that connect people to the ones they love?" Richard looked down at his remarkable daughter, this brilliant, brave little girl who'd helped bring down a criminal empire before her 8th birthday, and felt his heart overflow with love and pride. "Sophie, you're going to build things that I never even dreamed of. You're going to change the world. We'll change it together," she said firmly. "Like a family should." As Richard held his daughter close, watching the city wake up below them, he thought about Elena and the sacrifice she'd made. She'd given up everything to protect Sophie, never knowing that her daughter would grow up to be the one who finally brought their enemies to justice. But Elena had been right about one thing from the very beginning. Sophie was the best of both of them, and she was going to change the world. She already had. She shrugged, pulling her thin jacket closer. "Maybe yesterday. I can't remember." Without hesitation, Richard stood and extended his hand. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. There's a nice restaurant just upstairs. You can have whatever you want." For a moment she hesitated, studying his face with an intensity that unnerved him. Then, slowly, she placed her small, ice-cold hand in his. As they walked toward the station's upscale dining area, Richard found himself stealing glances at her profile. Something about her was familiar, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the determined set of her tiny jaw, even the way she walked despite her obvious exhaustion. The hostess at Antonio's looked skeptical when she saw the poorly dressed child, but one look from Richard silenced any objection. Soon they were seated at a corner table, and the little girl was devouring a plate of chicken fingers with the desperation of someone who truly hadn't eaten in days. "What's your name, honey?" Richard asked gently. "Sophie," she said between bites, not looking up from her food. "Sophie. That's a beautiful name. I'm Richard. Where do you live, Sophie?" She stopped eating for a moment, her fork suspended in midair. When she finally looked up at him, those green eyes were filled with something that made Richard's blood run cold: hope, fear, and a devastating kind of recognition all mixed together. "I don't have anywhere to live," she said quietly. "Mama said. Before she went to the Angels. She said I should come here. To the big train station. She said." Sophie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She said my daddy would find me here." Richard's coffee cup slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the saucer. "Your daddy?" Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "She showed me his picture. Every night before bed. She said he was important, with dark hair and kind eyes, and that he worked with trains." The world seemed to tilt around Richard. The description, the location, the timing, it was all starting to add up in ways that terrified him. "Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse, "what was your mama's name?" "Elena Rodriguez," she whispered. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Elena. Beautiful, laughing Elena from 8 years ago. The brief, passionate relationship that had ended when she moved back to Arizona to care for her sick mother. They'd lost touch when he'd thrown himself into expanding his business empire. Sophie was still watching him with those impossibly green eyes, eyes that Richard suddenly realized were exactly like his own. Very slowly, as if in a dream, Sophie slipped down from her chair and walked around the table to where Richard sat frozen. She climbed onto his lap with the natural ease of a child who belonged there, placed her small hands on either side of his face, and whispered the words that would change everything. "Daddy, it's you." But how could she know Portuguese, a language Elena had never spoken,